Thank you for having me here. Really hard to follow all these beautiful pictures of amazing landscapes. And so what I have to talk about is 6 by 6 inches. And we've heard a lot about phytoremediation already throughout the day, and you know, it's really hard to follow. I kind of feel like I'm the amateur here in this entire conference. I'm not a landscape architect. I'm not a soil scientist. But so I did something in 2011, which is this field guide to phytoremediation. And I guess it's something, if you Google phytoremediation, it shows up, right? And so you know, it's sort of a project that keeps giving and allows me to continue to explore this subject. And as I said, not as a soil scientist, but as a designer. So I want to explain a little bit of how I got to researching the techniques of phytoremediation, of how to clean brownfields with plants, or the opportunity to do that. And it was really, when I started reading about it myself, I found it really hard and intimidating, the reports that I would read. And so this is an attempt to translate some of that language of EPA reports into plain language, into English. And it's something that I think Scott Kellogg mentioned this morning also, that there's a great need to sort of empower citizens, and especially communities that are affected by a lot of contamination, with the ability of better understanding, you know, how this technique might work, but also what even is contamination and what are the hazards. And so this little booklet offers, I'll show some images later, offers sort of DIY instructions of how you could do this in your backyard, or how you could do this in a community garden. But the project itself was also sort of an instruction for myself. So this is an image of a community garden in the South Bronx, where as I was writing this, I was also sort of trying to do this myself. And so it was sort of an experiment of seeing what happens if I follow everything that I've learned and try to translate that into sort of a DIY project. As Kathy mentioned in the introduction, I did this as part of my goal or idea as an urban designer to really create agency for citizens to, you know, be able to shape their own city and be able to have a voice among people. And I do this through, you know, engaging people and participating in projects and being actively sort of engaged in their built and natural environment. And it started out of an interest in this, which is also sort of the subject of this conference, right? These abandoned, vacant lots, there's something growing on them. It was an interest in sort of the relationship between vacant land and development. This is a vacant lot in Brooklyn. And in New York City, despite a perpetual housing crisis for decades, about 7% of the land is vacant, and a lot of it is in residential neighborhoods. And as you can see in the little sort of zoomed in circle, many of these sites are relatively small. So more than half of all the vacant sites in New York City are only 2,500 square feet, which is the kind of typical lot size on a New York City block. More than 80% are smaller than 5,000 square feet. And so part of why they remain vacant for a really long time is the cost of development, and part of that is also the cost of remediation, as Angeline mentioned, that's often very complicated and very regulated. And so developers tend to wait for opportunities to consolidate land and build bigger projects, and then the cost of all of this seems to be more effective. But and so here's sort of a diagram that's part of this booklet that explains sort of the different costs, and this has been mentioned a lot today, that the dig and dump is costly, is also not very environmentally friendly to the neighbors, because it's a lot of trucks with dirt that, you know, go by your property potentially. Phytoremediation, on the other hand, could be more cost effective, but also takes very long. But there's a sort of potential in these vacant sites, and this is something where I want to quote from an essay that has really influenced me as an architect, by Ignacio Sola Morales Rubio, and the essay is called Terrain Vague, and there he describes the presence of urban vacant land as internal to the city yet external to its everyday use, foreign to the urban system, mentally excluded from our perception of the city, but physically they're right in our neighborhood. And so they're an opportunity to imagine possible alternatives. And so what I began to do from sort of doing this initial research about vacant land in the city and an interest in remediation is to actually really begin to understand or even ask myself, what is this contamination? Where does it come from? And how did it get here? And what does it really mean to human health? So this is a graphic that is not part of the book. It was shown in the community garden in the field lab. But it's really sort of beginning to unpack just even the knowledge about contamination. There are two types, and we've heard this before. It's really, in the guide, we call it elements and compounds. Elements are the heavy metals is often used as another word, lead being the most common, whereas compounds are the ones that are made up of several elements. And so this is important to understand also the limits of phytoremediation and the opportunities, because as we've heard before, the compounds can be broken down into its original parts, like hydrocarbons into hydro and carbon, and as they go back into what is actually natural elements, they are no longer toxic to our human body, whereas with the what's called inorganic or metals, those toxins, they stay in the plant, as been discussed before. So this was sort of the first initial step of understanding and also communicating what are these different things and where do they come from. And then another part of understanding the process of phytoremediation is this diagram of the 6 sort of different processes of either extracting a contaminant from the soil or absorbing it and being able to actually degrade it or immobilize it through a process using either microbes or what's called volatilization, where, and this is sort of the diagram up here on the left, where with particular plants and particular toxins, they actually have the ability to completely evaporate the contaminants into the air. Here are some further images of the booklet. It was a Kickstarter project, and we printed 2,000 copies. This is literally like one of 5 that I have left, but it's downloadable. And I want to talk a little bit about then doing the experiment myself as part of this process. So this is an image of the field lab. This is at La Finca del Sur. This is a community garden in the South Bronx. They had approached me and offered their site for this experiment. They knew their site was contaminated. It's in an industrial neighborhood. It sits between a rail yard and a highway. And here on the left, you can see a historic map. This is typically what's done as a phase 1 investigation, that you kind of look at the history of the site, and if the uses, in this case, it was a casket factory, it suggests that there might be some contamination. Arsenic is often in the kinds of material, is used for, in wood, blanking on the word, but in kind of used when you work with wood. And so they knew it was contaminated. They were gardening there anyways, like many gardens do, with a layer of mulch and in a specific, just in gardening beds, and were very careful about separating the compost. And so we did this experiment by setting up a field where we used 4 plants, one of them being mugwort, which is a weed that was in abundance on the site. And then in addition to that, we planted sunflowers, basket willow, Indian mustard. And then we designed these tubes as a way of providing information about what we were doing there, but also as sort of garden furniture where you could sit on, you could store your tools in there. And we used that for a series of workshops that we would host at the site. We were kind of careful to try to build all of this. So the tubes are of cardboard. The vinyl that we printed information on was biodegradable vinyl. So we were sort of trying to not add any contamination to the site, and even though this takes much longer than plants to break up the vinyl, but the idea is that we're conscious about the environment of the site in particular. And we worked on this experiment for 2 years. So we tested the plants before the first season of planting. And so this is, I don't know if you can see all of this. So this is a graph that was actually, kind of surrounding one of these tubes. And it's showing here on the left the levels of contamination for various kinds of uses as regulated by New York State. You mentioned this also earlier, Angela, and every state has their own rules. But so this is for New York State. There are different levels depending on what your use is. The most stringent and therefore the smallest levels, of course, here on the right being if you want to grow plants on it or have agriculture on the land. And then here, this bar on the left are the values that we tested for heavy metals in the spring of 2011. Everything in yellow being above any of the regulated levels. And then we tested again in the fall of 2011, and then the following year we did the same. And what we found was, so in the fall of 2011, there was an initial amazing surprise. It looked very positive, so many of the numbers that are now in green are below at least some of the thresholds for, uses for housing, not necessarily for growing edible plants. But then we also found some sort of unexplained surprises in this, that the following year some of the same values went up again. And this may just simply be a mistake in how we did the testing, how we collected the soil that we then sent to the lab. We also tested the plants, and I know we made mistakes there, that we didn't clean them well enough, so the contaminated soil that then dried up and was still on the roots may have skewed that test. And so this is all to say that, we set out to see, can we do this ourselves as citizens and as non-soil scientists? And it's difficult. You make mistakes and you learn from them. At the same time, I would say there's sort of, so here's another graph sort of showing what happened over 2 years with 2 of the plants, basket willow and sunflower, where you can see how, some of the values dipped up again in the spring of 2012 and then went back down. The project has sort of this afterlife of being published, being exhibited, and we do workshops. We did a lot of workshops, although, and we've seen this maybe today, it's kind of difficult to do a workshop because phytoremediation takes a long time, so what do you actually do, right? You plant some willow or put a sunflower seed in a bucket. But yet part of this whole project was more finding ways to communicate the process itself, but also using it as a way to discuss contamination itself and maybe begin to demystify the idea of what contamination means and what cleanup also means, be it through plants or be it through any of the sort of regulated processes of dig and dump. And I hope we can have some time to talk about this a little more with the panel. Thank you.